Barend van Orley, also called Barend van Orley, Bernaert van Orley or Barend van Brussel, was a leading artist in Dutch and Flemish Renaissance painting, though he was at least as active as a leading designer of Brussels tapestry and, at the end of his life, stained glass. Although he never visited Italy, he belongs to the group of Italianizing Flemish painters called the Romanists, who were influenced by Italian Renaissance painting, in his case especially by Raphael. He was born and died in Brussels, and was the court artist of the Habsburg rulers, and served as a sort of commissioner of the arts for the Brussels Town Council. He was extremely productive, concentrating on the design of his works, and leaving their actual execution largely to others in the case of painting, and entirely so in the case of the tapestries and stained glass. This too may well have been learned from Raphael, whose workshop in Rome was unprecedentedly large. Accordingly, his many surviving works vary considerably in quality. There are many drawings, mostly studies for designs for tapestries and stained glass. Here his workshop would have produced full-scale cartoons for the tapestries, but these were normally lost in the course of weaving, when they were cut into strips. His paintings are generally either religious subjects or portraits, these mostly of Habsburgs, repeated in several versions by the workshop, with few mythological subjects, but his tapestries were more varied, reflecting the normal range of that medium, from biblical cycles to allegories, battle and hunting scenes. His father had been a tapestry designer in Brussels, and several of Bernard's descendants were artists. A number were active in the 18th century. His family came originally from Luxembourg, descendants from the seigneurs Dutch and Orley. His branch of the family then moved to the Duchy of Brabant, where his father Barent van Orley was born as an illegitimate child and lost his noble lineage. Bernard and his brother Everard were both born in Brussels. The painted wing panels of the sculpted Saluzzo retable are attributed to Barent van Orley, describing the life of St. Joseph. The retable itself is Gothic in style, but these wing panels already show some characteristic of the Renaissance style. The panels of the life of St. Roch in the St. James Church, Antwerp, have been ascribed to Everard van Orley. In 1512 Bernard van Orley married Agnes Segers. In 1539, shortly after Agnes' death, he married Katrina Helling-Kex. He had 9 children. His 4 boys followed in the footsteps of the father and also became painters. Apprenticeship. It is sometimes presumed that Bernard van Orley completed his art education in Rome in the school of Raphael. However, there are no reliable sources to prove this. At the time, there were only a few painters with some renown in Brussels, such as Van Latham, and painters from the Koningsloo family. It is therefore much more likely that he was initially taught in the workshop of his father, an obscure painter whose name appears as master in the Liga of the Guild of St. Luke of Antwerp, and who had several pupils. Bernard van Orley received his knowledge of the Renaissance style from engravings and the Raphael cartoons for tapestries of scenes from the Acts of the Apostles that were present in Brussels between 1516 and 1520. They are now in London. They were made to be woven into tapestries for Pope Leo X by Peter van Alst. Paintings. One of his earliest signed works dates from 1512, the Triptych of the Carpenters and Masons Corporation of Brussels, also called the Apostle Altar. The central panel is in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and the side panels in the Royal Museums of Fine Art Arts of Belgium, Brussels. It recounts the lives of two apostles, Thomas and Matthew. It was originally commissioned for a chapel in the Our Blessed Lady of Zavel Church in Brussels. In his early works he continued the traditions of Jan van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden and the followers, but then he gradually began integrating the Italianate motifs of the Renaissance, representing figure types and the spatial relationships such as found in the works of Raphael. In 1515 he was asked to take over the commission of a triptych for the Brotherhood of the Holy Cross in a chapel in the St. Walburga Church in Vennes. He finished and delivered it in 1522. The left panel is on display in the Royal Museum of Fine Arts of Belgium. The front shows St. Helena meeting the Pope in an architectural setting of Renaissance buildings and Italianate motifs. The back is a grisaille painting of Christ falling under the cross. The right panel is on display in the Galleria Sarbauda, Turin, showing Charlemagne receiving the relics of the Passion. From 1515 on, he and his workshop received many orders for portraits, including from the royal family and from people connected to the court. In 1516 he painted 7 portraits of Charles, who had just become King of Spain, and portraits of his brother Ferdinand, the later King of Hungary, and his 4 sisters. The 1516 painted copy of the Shroud of Turin, commonly attributed to Albrecht Dürer, is also sometimes attributed to Barend van Orley. By 1517 he was recognized as a master in the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke. On the 23rd of May 1518 he was appointed as the official court painter to the Regent of the Netherlands Margaret of Austria, replacing Jacopo de Barbary. In this position he became the head of an important workshop, making him one of the first entrepreneurial artists in Northern Europe. With this workshop he produced paintings and, especially after 1525, became a leading designer of tapestry, cartoons and stained glass windows. He held this position until 1527, when he, his family and several other artists fell into disgrace because of the Protestant sympathies. The family fled Brussels and settled in Antwerp. 5 years later, he returned to Brussels when he was reinstated by the new regent of the Netherlands, Maria of Austria. After his death in 1541, he was succeeded as court painter by his pupil Michael Coxey. Among his most important paintings is the triptych of Verge of Patience, also called the Job Altarpiece, commissioned in 1521 by Margaret of Austria to illustrate a poem she wrote about the virtue of patience. The interior panels represent the trials of Job, while the outer panels recount the parable of Lazarus and Dives. This triptych is completely by the hand of Barend van Orley. He must have been especially proud of his work, as he signed it twice and added his coat of arms as well as his monogram BVO and the motto ELX sign TYT. This relates to his artistic opinion that an artist should be a man fully integrated in his time. The same museum houses another triptych by the same painter, the Hanton Triptych. This triptych was commissioned by Philippe Hanton, first secretary in the secret council of Charles V. The middle panel depicts a poignant pietà against an archaic golden background, painted in a very personal style with influences of the Flemish primitives and Albrecht Dürer. Barend van Orley was, together with Jan Gossaert, among the first to introduce strong musculature in Flemish paintings. The left panel shows Philippe Hanton and his sons, and the right panel his wife and her daughters. The triptych The Last Judgment was commissioned by the almoners of the Cathedral of Our Lady, Antwerp in 1525. It is one of his best works in its originality and mastery. The paintings in grisaille on the back were executed by Peter de Kempenier, who was, at that time, an apprentice in the Van Orley's workshop. The altarpiece of Calvary in the Ons Lieve Vrouwekerk in Bruges dates from 1534. It was commissioned by Margaret of Austria originally for the funeral monument in the Church of Bru in Bourg-en-Bresse in Burgundy. The side panels were finished much later by Marcus Gerards the Elder and brought to Bruges by Margaret of Parma, regent of the Netherlands under King Philip II of Spain. The central part represents the Calvary, the left panel the crown of thorns, the scourging of Christ, and Christ carrying the cross. The right panel depicts the Pietà and the Limbo of the Just. His portraits were more subdued and thoughtful, such as his portraits of Charles V and Margaret of Austria. He usually represents his subjects in a seated static position, their expressionless faces without much psychological depth of feelings. His workshop produced several copies of these portraits, especially the portrait of Charles V. They were offered as gift to visitors or courtiers. He usually represented saints in a full-length portrait, such as his Mary with Child and John the Baptist, with a background of an opened colonnade, a baldachin or a set of trees. This type of composition can be found in many 16th-century paintings. Bernaert van Orley often signed his paintings, especially in his early period before 1521, with the coat of arms of the Seigneurs d'Orley, argent 2 pallets gules. It had been contended that these are the signature of his father Valentine when Albrecht Dürer visited the Netherlands in 1520 to be present at the coronation of the new Emperor, Charles V. He called Barend van Orley the Raphael of the Netherlands. Dürer, who stayed as a guest in Van Orley's house between the 27th of August and the 2nd of September 1520, also painted a portrait which some scholars identify as Van Orley. Dürer had a profound influence on Van Orley, who in his later works tried to find a synthesis between Dürer and another Renaissance master, Raphael. Some important pupils of Van Orley were Michael Coxey, Peter Kirk van Aelst and Peter de Kempenier, who continued in the style of Romanism. Other pupils, such as Lancelot Blondel and Jan Vermeyen, continued in the painter-designer tradition of the master. Together with Jan Gosset and Quentin Matsys, Barend van Orley is regarded as one of the leading innovators of the 16th-century Flemish painting. By adopting the style and manner of the Italian Renaissance, his paintings are executed with great care to minute details and stand out by the brilliant colors. Tapestries. During this period, tapestries were held in higher esteem than paintings, and were more expensive, often woven with gold and silver thread. They had additional value as decoration and insulation for the large, bare and cold walls of palaces and church choirs. Barend van Orley had already started designing tapestries in his youth, but after 1530 he seemed to have stopped painting altogether, applying himself solely to cartoons for tapestries and designs for stained glass windows. One of the first tapestry cartoons ascribed to him were the 4 cartoons for the legend of Our Lady on the Zavel, commissioned by Frans van Taxis. One of them represents the patron and 2 emperors, Maximilian I and his father Frederick III. This is an allusion to the postal contract obtained by Frans van Taxis, giving him a monopoly for the postal system between Brussels and the rest of the empire. The style of these tapestries is traditional, with an overcrowded composition set in a 2-dimensional plane. For the 1520s on, under the influence of the Raphael tapestries woven at Brussels for Pope Leo X, Van Orley's tapestries began to increasingly resemble paintings, more in line with the aesthetics of the Renaissance, as can be seen in his Passion series, one set in the Royal Palace of Madrid and the other set dispersed over several museums, and the Lamentation, in the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. These tapestries, some woven by Peter de Panamaker, clearly show the influence of the tapestry cartoons of Raphael and the work of Dürer in the rendering of the figure types. Since Dürer had been a guest in the house of Van Orley at the time the contracts for these tapestries were signed, it is possible that the two artists may have discussed the design. For the first time in Passion tapestries, the figures received dramatic weight through the large size and the position in the foreground. Battle of Pavia tapestries. Later life. Van Orley became a member of the Brotherhood of St. Sebastian in the Church of St. Gagericus. More than half of the members of this brotherhood were weavers by profession. In his later years he made the 12 small cartoons, perhaps with the help of Jan Giedels, for his best-known tapestry series, The Hunts of Maximilian. Each of the 12 tapestries represented a different month of the year. They were commissioned by Emperor Charles V of someone at the imperial court. It took 2 years and 60 weavers to realize them. These hunts took place in the vicinity of Brussels or in the Sonian forest. In the cartoons the rigidity of the composition makes way to a greater dynamism. He displayed his talent for depicting large-scale scenes of imaginary hunts within a realistic, picturesque, and minutely detailed landscape. For this project, Van Orley sought the help of specialists in hunting and consulted the Livre de Chasse by Gaston Phoebus. With those cartoons he, and also Johannes Stradanis, set an example for the followers by opening up new paths in Italianism with the classic breadth and ease in transforming the rendering of landscapes, successfully integrating it into Netherlandish traditional modes. This dynamism would reach its peak in the Baroque style and the work of Peter Paul Rubens. The iconography of hunting parties would be greatly imitated by the tapestry workshops of the Leniers family, especially Everett Leniers, the leading dyers and weavers in Brussels for over 400 years. Another famous set of tapestries were commissioned by Henry III of Nassau Breda at about 1528 to 1530. They were to glorify the ancestors of the House of Nassau. The tapestries were lost in a fire in 1760, but the cartoons still exist and are in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. These tapestries were among the first to unite equestrian portraiture with more informal group portraiture. The Battle of Pavia is another set of 7 tapestries on display in the Museo di Capodimonte, while the 7 small cartoons are owned by the Louvre, Paris. In these tapestries, Barend van Orley created a detailed historical authenticity on a grand scale, with life-size figures within imagined surroundings. The tapestry Hercules carrying the heavenly spheres was commissioned by King John II of Portugal in 1530 and can be seen in the Royal Palace of Madrid. The armillary was a symbol of the King of Portugal. Stained glass. At the end of his life he also started designing stained glass windows. The windows in the north transept of the St. Michael and Gurdula Cathedral in Brussels depict members of the House of Habsburg, Charlemagne and Elizabeth of Hungary, and scenes from the legend of the miraculous host, while the windows in the south transept depict Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia and his wife Maria of Austria, sister of Charles V, kneeling in front of a vertical trinity with St. Louis and the Virgin with Child. These windows mark a change in style. The royal dynasty was still embedded within a religious framework, but the donor was now emphasized and not the venerated saint. It was also no longer deemed necessary to legitimize the position of the sovereign by a genealogical tree, as Philip the Handsome, the father of Charles V, was not represented. These windows can be ascribed with certainty to drawings by Barend van Orley. They were executed by the master glassworker Verge. He also designed the stained glass windows for the St. Rumble's Cathedral, Milan, depicting Margaret of Austria, her third husband Philibert II, Duke of Savoy, and Christ entering Jerusalem. These windows were destroyed during the religious conflicts between 1566 and 1585. In 2004, an unpublished color drawing of these windows was discovered in Valenciennes. The St. Bavo Kirk in Haarlem, Holland, also has a set of stained glass windows designed by Van Orley, depicting the donor Joris van Egmond, Bishop of Utrecht, and his patron St. Martin. Other artists in the family Van Orley. Barend van Orley belonged to a large family of painters, starting with his father, 1. Valentijn van Orley, Philip van Orley, Barend van Orley, painter and tapestry designer, Everard van Orley, painter, Germar van Orley, painter, 2. Barend van Orley, Michael van Orley, Hieronymus I van Orley, painter, Giles van Orley, painter, 3. Giles van Orley, Hieronymus II van Orley, 4. Hieronymus II van Orley, Hieronymus III van Orley, portrait painter, decorator, etcher, Peter van Orley, miniaturist and landscape painter, Francois van Orley, history painter, Richard I van Orley, 5. Peter van Orley, Richard II van Orley, painter and etcher, Jan van Orley, painter and etcher.